Dr. Sonika Gupta has MA, MPhil, and PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi in Global Politics and Chinese Studies. She is currently an associate professor in Chinese Studies and Global Politics at Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, Chennai. In 2011, she founded IITM, China Studies Center, and its coordinator from April 2011 to July 2015. Her current research interest includes in Tibetan exile community, India's Himalayan borderlands. Her current projects includes a Norwegian Research Council funded project on mapping Tibetan settlement as socio-ecological systems. Her recent publication includes in 2021 with Bala Subramaniam Mathura published Disciplining Statelessness, Fragmentary Outcomes of the Tibetan Rehabilitation Policy in India, Asian Studies Review. Again in the same year, Frontiers in Flex, Indo-Tibetan Border, 1946 to 1948. In 2019, with Mathura Balasubramaniam, published From Refugee to Rights, Mashnukatila Tibetan Colony in New Delhi, Kritis Kethnography, Swedish Journal of Anthropology. In 2019, Enduring Liminality, Voting Rights and Tibetan Exile in India, Asians Ethnicity. Dr. Sonika Gupta will talk on Tibetan rehabilitation in Arunachal Pradesh, local states and geopolitical context. Kindly proceed, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Seringdurunla. Thank you so much also to TPI for inviting me for this event. It's always a pleasure to be back amongst some of the old friends from TPI. And thank you for that really generous introduction. What I'm going to be speaking on today, it was mentioned, is some issues regarding Tibetan rehabilitation in Arunachal. And it's a pity we could not listen to Uden's full presentation. So I hope she will come back after I'm done so that we can finish hers as well. What I'd like to do is I'd like to share my some slides with you guys. And hopefully it'll go faster if I have some slides on the board. So let's see. Can you guys see the slides?
No.
Now?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Okay, so I might not be able to see your questions in the chat box while I'm speaking. So this work is actually at a fairly preliminary stage. So I look forward to any comments and any questions that you might have from this actually very well-informed audience, both of the scholars at TPI, people who have actually been in the areas that I'm talking about, and other scholars who worked on Arunachal. So I'm looking forward to a good discussion on this. I replaced the word geopolitical contexts or local state and geopolitical contexts with anxieties, because the more I read on this, I realized that there is a lot of unpacking here to do about what different stakeholders in this particular issues are anxious about. So what are some of these anxieties that I'm talking about? Obviously, if you look at it at a very macro level, there is the anxiety about Arunachal as a border state, and the territorial dispute with China seems to be moving in not very reassuring direction as of now. Then there is obviously, the issue that has dominated and will dominate the attention of the Tibetan community all over the world, but specifically in India, including also the attention of the Indian government and many other governments of the world, which is the issue of reincarnation of His Holiness. And Arunachal is a very important piece of the puzzle in that, because there is a very large Tibetan Buddhist population in this region. And there are existing solidarities on the basis of religion, but there are also certain conflicting interests. Then there are anxieties regarding, again, on a fairly macro scale, if you look at it, regarding globalization, right? So how is global capital actually penetrating the region and kind of having an impact on the ground interactions between different stakeholders? What anxieties of access to resources, access to land, and access to government capacity, capability, all of that is producing as frictions on the ground between different communities. So these are some of the things that I would argue have a kind of, they feed into what today we are seeing as very assertive articulations of identity politics on the ground in Arunachal. And this identity politics has a very apparent territorial and spatial outcome. So there is an identification of who belongs to which part of Arunachal, which land belongs to whom, who is legitimately there and who is not legitimately there. So all of these things are actually interacting in the way people are perceiving each other as communities. And there is an existence of a very fairly complex interaction between different communities. Now, the Tibetan community here, especially the refugee community, or because refugee is not a legal term that the Indian government can employ. So the refugees Tibetans who are on RC, that would be a better way of putting it, or people who are displaced from Tibet, that population is actually fairly small. So it's to give you a sense of, it's if you take the official CTA estimates, what is available in CTA figures, it would not be more than 5,000. But if you take in unofficial figures, estimates do not go beyond 10,000, right? And the population of Arunachal is actually 1.6 million or 16 lakhs. So that should give us a kind of a context to what is the kind of juxtaposition we are talking in terms of groups. And however, that does not mean that the attention that the Tibetan community has got in Arunachal, especially those who are living in settlements, is proportionate to their numbers. Actually, it is fairly disproportionate in terms of the negative kind of attention from local state bodies as well as student organizations. So what is the role of the TRP, or the Tibetan Rehabilitation Policy, in all of this? So I'll just give you a very, very quick this thing on the TRP, which I'm sure most of you here are already familiar with. So the TRP is, it was framed in 2014 in consultation, of course, with the government of India, primarily to standardize land tenure for Tibetan settlements. So Tibetan settlements have, they have varied kinds of land tenures, and this was a continued precarity for those settlements, for any settlement, that they did not have an understanding of what exactly the lease is and when the lease would expire. In some cases, that was the case. In some cases, there was no lease. In some cases, people were living on land which was not actually handed over under any lease. So a standardized lease was introduced, which was a 20-year lease. So from the date of commencement of the lease to the next 20 years, the settlements would have access to that land to use. One of the things that the Tibetan Rehabilitation Policy did, in addition with standardization of lease, is to reiterate actually some of the existing arrangements with regard to welfare benefits through the state and the central governments. Some of these were strengthened, some were introduced new. So for example, people would probably be allowed if the policy was implemented by the relevant state, respective state, they would be allowed to access agricultural subsidies if they were an agricultural settlement, right? And currently, the status of the TRPs is adopted by 4 states in India. And implementation is underway in Karnataka and Himachal. In Arunachal, it created an immediate backlash. So before we go there, just a very quick, this again, I'm sure most of you are familiar with, so this is a bit of superfluous. So these are the settlements in the order they were established in Arunachal. Tezu, Bomdila, Tenzingnan, Miao, and Tuting. Tawang is marked here in this map, but it's marked as a place where there is scattered population of Tibetan refugees rather than a settlement. Okay, and if you look at the kind of the details with regard to the population and what the trajectory of each one of them is, you can see, like I said earlier, this is not a very large population, though it is the 4th largest population of Tibetan refugees in India, if you look at the settlements in India. But it's not by comparison or relatively speaking to the population of the state itself, a very large population. So when the TRP was announced, in fact, immediately there was a kind of a statement from many student organizers, from at least the All Arunachal Pradesh Students' Union, the APSU. They had immediately kind of said that, this should not be implemented in Arunachal. And there has been since then consistently a resistance to implementation of the policy in Arunachal. It was actually formally adopted by the state government in July-August 2017, and the period from 2017 to 2019 saw a lot of protests and demonstrations, and in fact some violent incidents as well in the state against the policy, and some particularly targeting either Tibetans who live in settlements or Tibetan-owned businesses. There are multiple student organizations that have presented their view on this, that why the Tibetan rehabilitation policy should not be implemented. Some of the more prominent student organizations are APSU and SUMA. Now, what is common to to how student organizations in Arunachal, the indigenous organizations, they're looking at the issue of refugees, is that they look at it not as an issue of Tibetans in Arunachal, but they look at it as an issue of indigenous rights. It is the rights of indigenous people against those who don't belong in this region or who are not from this region. So, and this has a much broader context. So Tibetans, despite the fact that they are actually the smallest group in this, are actually part of a much larger articulation of what one could call an anti-refugee movement in Arunachal, in which the Chakmas and the Hajongs are actually the most identified communities by the groups that have an opposition to this. And I think to understand how this issue is historically placed, we would have to go back actually to the colonial times. And we can't do all of that right here, but the most important things is the territorial aspect and the enumeration aspect of this. So some of these things which I've listed here, the Bengal Eastern Frontier Regulation of 1873, which of course is the basis of the inner line permit in Arunachal, actually was something, again, that enabled the protection of British capital in the region. And it was intended not actually to identify regions as those belonging to indigenous people, but to enable greater exploitation of resources from the region for British capital and private capital under the British colonialism. Right? Then there is the Chin Hills Regulation that followed in 1896, which again levied taxes on people who are not from the region. So there was an enumeration of who belongs. And then the two census, the 1901 census, and then the 1931 Schedule of Tribes. These are, especially the 1931 Schedule of Tribes, they continue to actually be referred even in government documents as the basis for enumerating community groups in Arunachal. Then, especially the 1919 Government of India Act that created the wholly and partially excluded areas, wherein the British colonial administration kind of adopted a policy of benign neglect, but that translated also into some amount of self or autonomous jurisdiction in these areas. So this is very important to keep in mind, because the issue of Tibetan refugees is actually not an issue that you can pluck out from this history, because it is actually part of a much larger articulation of identity that references all of this. Then there is then one must be familiar along with this, along with the spatial and the political creation of communities and territories in Arunachal. One must also be aware of what is the history of refugee migration to AP. So the three main groups, the Chakma, Hajongs, and the Tibetans, have actually very different histories of migration to the region. So the Chakmas and Hajongs, they were facing both religious persecution, and then when the Kaptai hydroelectric dam was power project displaced many of them in the mid 60s, and they then came over from East Pakistan to neighboring areas in Tripura. And there was a local resistance in Tripura, because at that point in time there was quite a large influx of people from across the border. And then the Indian government at that point in time decided to settle these people, primarily in Lohit, Tirap, and Changlang districts. They tried also initially to settle people in Bihar, but the climatic conditions were just not conducive, and many people who had probably gone over to Bihar did come back to Arunachal when the central initiative happened. Now, there is a lot of back and forth on this. The view that the student organizations take is that this was done without local, any kind of local consultation. Now, at that point in time, Arunachal was not a state. It was not even a union territory. It was known as NEFA, and it was centrally administered. So it is seen as an imposition. It is seen as imposition. But there are other documents from the archives that show that there was some amount of consultation and some justifications that the central government had given, especially with regard to fulfilling refugee obligations in settling people in Arunachal. For the Tibetans, now the history of Tibetan presence in what today we know as Arunachal is actually pre-colonial times as well, right? So despite the fact this is an area that used to see a lot of movement between Tibet proper and across the Sila Pass as well, in areas like Tawang, Dirang, all of these places, there were Tibetans living in this area. But what is identified as people who were displaced, they primarily came in 59 and in 62, right? And they were settled in Lohit, Changlang, but dominantly in West Kameng and Tawang. Now, in the state level organizational politics, there is no distinction made between these two different histories. And the issue of the Chakma, Hajong, and Tibetan refugees is conflated. And there is a reason for this. There is a strategic reason for this. There's an instrumental reason for this. And it makes a lot of political sense to not separate these. So what happened, in Arunachal was a kind of a ground up swelling it was a ground up assertion of identifying who was not first as actually an Arunachali, but as who was indigenous to the region, right? And right from the beginning, APSU has played a very prominent role in this. APSU was formed soon after, in 1947, so at the time of independence. And initially it was known as the Adi Mishiming Student Union, which was joined later by the Galong Adi and Eastern Adi Association. So which then came to be known as the All Nefa Students Union. Now, after Arunachal became a union territory in 72, the name changed to APSU. Now, APSU has very strong, like it's mentioned in the slide, they have very strong ground game. So they have, they have good recruitment, as well as in networks, in educational institutions, including schools, professional colleges, um, uh, higher education institutions, plus of the students who go out of the state to study, right? Summa came into prominence, at least that's what I have been able to find. So I would actually appreciate anybody who can point me in a different direction. That Summa seems to have come into prominence in 2017 in response to the adoption of the Tibetan Rehabilitation Policy in AP. And they do seem to have a considerable mobilization in West Kameng district and presence obviously all over the state, especially in Itanagar. NESO, that is the Northeast Students Association, is the association of all students in the Northeastern region, and APSU joined and made common cause with NESO in 1994 for building a solidarity in the region against immigrants and refugees. So this is the context in which the Tibetan rehabilitation policy is looked at by student activists and by political activists on the ground. That this is an issue of indigenous people versus those who do not belong here. It's not an issue of people who have been displaced. It's not an issue of people who have faced any hardships, but the fact that there is no distinction made between different histories of different groups of people as they have settled is testament to the fact that there is a political positioning on the issue of the figure of the refugee. Okay. Now, in 1979, we actually begin to see, especially with the APSU, anti-refugee assertion. Now, this is in context of the Assam movement that's going on, right? The issues that raised with regard to people who had migrated to again, Assam was not a place which has not seen migration. It has seen pre-colonial times, colonial times migration, all of that is there. So in that sense, when it came down to defining who is Assamese, it became an issue of mapping territory to people. And Arunachal being a neighboring state was people were concerned that there'll be a spillover. So one of the first demands that the APSU makes in 1979 is a solution of the Assam-Arunachal boundary. And then to talk about who are people who are foreign to what is identified therefore then the boundary of Arunachal. And then a more specific demand about withdrawal of land allotments and trade licenses to people who do not belong. And an effective check against further infiltration of foreign nationals. This is where the issue of refugees is, they map it to this, that we do not want further settlements in Arunachal. And so at this point in time, the politics is becoming more and more confrontational, right? And the APSU has given its first call for Bandh in the state in 1980. And this slowly begins to be the kind of agitational politics that APSU is now building from ground up. And they go into district level bandhs in 1982. Then in 85, because of the Assam Accord being signed, APSU puts forward these demands that Chakmas, Hajongs, Tibetans, Yobins, they put them in a same category because these people are identified as those who have come from the outside. Now, this is quite different from people who are identified as scheduled tribes in Assam, but not scheduled tribes in Arunachal. So these four categories of people are identified as those who violate the Bengal Eastern Frontier Regulation Act of 1873 because they are not people who can buy land here or who can make claims on state resources, right? And tied to this is that refugee settlements, because this is a border state, they are seen as a threat to long-term territorial integrity of Arunachal. And this is something that happens in refugee communities, for refugee communities in many parts of the world, or minorities, not just refugee communities or minorities. There's always an assertion of that the population of that particular community is increasing, and this is a threat to the local interests. And this you see actually as a fairly recurrent argument in APSU's and Suma's politics, right? Along with this, there is also a very long-standing history of martyrdom in service of the anti-refugee movement. So this is important to understand, because this is a righteous cause for the people who are involved in it, and student organizations have, legitimately got very wide representation in the state. So the first identified martyr was Kipa Kache, who was actually a class 6 student when he died in a demonstration in 1986, died in CRPF firing. The picture that you see is actually a picture of the commemoration of Martyrs' Day from last year. This is the Kipa Kache Memorial Pillar, and there have been other figures in this history who have died for the cause, like Tobombam or Khoradolu. These are people that the APSU commemorates as martyrs to the cause. So there is a very emotionally and politically well-grounded understanding that this is a righteous cause. Then something that is very apparent is that there is a kind of a disjuncture between state level politics and central level politics on the issue. So, and these are some of the things I've just listed. I don't know if can you guys read the slides? Is it possible to read? Is it big enough to read? Maybe I need to now, can you read?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I should have increased the size of the slides earlier. Okay, so if you look at how this is playing out, so for example, in 1994 first, there is a Delhi Chalo Abhiyan, where the APSU wants to meet Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, and they go and camp in Delhi for 2 weeks, and they're not able to meet the Prime Minister. In fact, they allege that the Prime Minister actually met Chakma groups rather than having not met the APSU and the other student groups from Arunachal. And so this is unfolding on the ground as a kind of a feeling that we are not being heard. So there's a referendum, people's referendum held in 1995 in Itanagar to demand that refugees should not be allowed into the state. And the state level units of national parties like Congress I actually support this. So the CM, the APCM, who is Apang, he says that he gives the center a deadline of December 31st of 1995 to actually evict refugees. In response to this, center constitutes a high-level committee. And this is a very standard response, to this kind of a thorny issue that you've seen with Tibetan refugees in different parts of India. It might not be an issue just of eviction, it might be other issues, but there is a lot of bureaucratic back and forth between the center and the state on this. At the same time, what happens is the NHRC, it's filed a Supreme Court petition to the Supreme Court alleging that human rights of the Chakmas and the Hajoms are being violated by state level authorities. So the judgment comes and it says that the Chakmas and Hajoms cannot be actually denied what is their right, especially if they are born in India. Now, the APSU obviously rejects this and gives a Bandh call for that year's Republic Day. And the state level political parties also support that, and they constitute a committee to say that we will not honor this. Right? In 2000, then again the PUCL, it takes the petition of the Committee for Citizenship Rights of the Chakmas of Arunachal Pradesh, which is CCR-CAP. They file a writ petition in the Delhi High Court to argue for electoral rights for Chakmas. Now, under India's citizenship rights, this is under citizenship law, this is their right. If you're born after 1955 and in India, then you have the right to be an Indian citizen, right? But this judgment has not been implemented at the local level. Then in 2010, again, you have a joint high-powered committee that meets in Itanagar. And currently, this is some of the recommendations of this committee are what is guiding the politics on this on the ground. Okay. Now,
can you please wrap up if possible?
Yeah, just 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. Now, these arguments are very similar to the arguments that are made with regard to Tibetans, right? So Tibetans have, they have fought similar cases in the court with regard to citizenship and passports and voting. And both Delhi and Karnataka High Courts in 2010 and I think 2013 had given judgments that all Tibetans born in India after 1955 they have right to citizenship. The CTA's response has been very, very conciliatory. So this is a picture from 2000, a news report from 2015 when the Home Kalon had gone to visit Arunachal. And, she said that people should not actually engage in this publicly, especially on social media. And there was a Tibetan refugees go back, the rallies were being held at that point in time. So it was a very worrying situation. In 2017, the issue has reignited again, where the BJP now is making an argument that Tibetans are not claiming citizenship. They are only staying in designated settlements. And he gives the justification that, we have to kind of respect this because India has human rights obligations according to international treaties. But especially in West Kameng district, it became actually fairly bad, where Tibetan businesses began to be identified, and the SUMA, the Students United Movement of all Arunachal, began to actually demand that this district administration identify who are the bona fide Tibetans and who are not. Now, Bomdila is a scattered settlement like in Tawang. So this became actually a fairly tense situation. And then there is this reciprocal identification of saying that Tibetans are doing illegal things or the Arunachalis are doing illegal things. I can talk about more about this if somebody is interested later on. So this also gets tied in then with what's happening both at the center and the regional level. So the SUMA demands therefore an NRC-like exercise in Arunachal, or they demand, the PRC issue, the permanent resident issue in Arunachal, which has nothing to do with Tibetans. Actually, it has nothing to do with refugees as well. There is a complex, Tibetan-owned complex that's set ablaze in Itanagar. So then the CEA protests. So this basically becomes something that goes beyond an articulation of Tibetans as refugees, right? Now, the Tibetans they are not similar to other refugees. So one prominent thing is they are not actively organized to pursue citizenship. The official position of the CTA is to retain the RC and to stay within settlements as far as possible. A few individuals in the community have pursued these rights through courts, but it's not the official position. CTA has been fairly non-confrontational. Their way to deal with it is to emphasize on common religious identity, cultural affinity with local communities, then offering local communities place in Tibetan educational and cultural organizations, right? But the issue has not settled. And I think just because the pandemic broke out, we had a bit of a break in this. But the situation on the ground is fairly confrontational. It is fairly juxtapositional. I'll leave you just with this one quote from Arjuna Durai, which I think is very relevant to the situation that we're observing. And I'm sorry if I have gone over the time. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your patience.